I'm Martin Christ. This is the portion of Wetlands where we talk about chemistry and plants and plant adaptations. I work for the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, the Watershed Improvement Branch. And when I'm stationed anywhere but the back room at the house, I'm stationed in Fairmont. And my email is there. So I'm in the Watershed Improvement Branch like Tommy. She is out of Charleston and covers the western portion of the state. I cover the northern portion of the state. I know some of you because I used to live in Morgantown and work with Friends of Deckers Creek. I continue to work with Friends of Deckers and a bunch of other watershed groups like Friends of Cheat, Save the Tiger. And I encourage you all to support your local watershed group. Feel free to interrupt me with questions anytime. When I ran through this before, I was a little short, and so I might need it. In grad school, I studied biogeochemistry. What the heck is that? Well, it's sort of a study of the movements and reservoirs of chemical quantities into and out of and within ecosystems. So this is the sort of model that biogeochemists like to make. On the right there, you see material coming in and out of a whole ecosystem. And there inside the big box, you see a lot of different components, such as the plants and animals, the soils, and then the stuff in soils that's available. And people make these all the time, and sometimes they're confusing and sometimes they help. But if I'm concerned with the movement of chemicals, you can see how I got interested in trying to figure out acid mine drainage and all that. And that got me working with Friends of Deckers Creek, and then that got me to working with the DEP. This is what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about diffusion of oxygen in air and water. Then I'm going to talk about energy and where different kinds of organisms get their energy. And basically, you burn fuel to get energy. Cars burn gasoline, we burn food. But in each case, you need an oxidant to burn your fuel with. And I'm going to talk about different oxidants. Then I'm going to talk about plants and stress. Now, I like chemistry, but if you don't like chemistry, I encourage you to just breathe and then to thank a plant, because when you breathe, you take in oxygen and give off CO2, and that's called respiration. But when a plant breathes, it takes in the CO2 and gives off oxygen, although we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And this is a very rough diagram. And of course, the way things really work, it's a lot more complicated. It's not just us that's breathing, it's also bugs and geckos and beavers and bacteria and all sorts of stuff. And we don't just give off CO2, we also give off a little heat, and sometimes we even get off a little work. And we get our energy from food, which of course comes from the plants. And we use that energy and that carbon to build our biomass. And as we're going through it all, we liberate some nutrients. I'm drawing the arrow into the soil. And then the tree, of course, takes those nutrients back, and it uses energy from light, and it builds biomass, and it makes food for us. So as I say, you can make it very complicated. But I just want to focus on this respiration part right now. Okay, so first, I have a thought experiment, and it's just this. This is a cubic yard of water, and this is a cubic yard of air. In this case, it's not regular air, it's just pure nitrogen, so no oxygen in it. And this water has no oxygen either. And I'm taking a peanut butter jar full of straight oxygen and attaching it to the cube. What is your instinct about which frog will taste the oxygen faster? Well, if your instinct is that the dog will taste the oxygen going through the air or through the nitrogen faster than through the water, you're of course right. And the basic principle, so this deals with diffusion. And the basic idea of diffusion is that if there's some here and there's none here, some of this will go over here. And the chemists and physicists have a fancy equation. J is the flux of this stuff moving. D is just a constant. And delta C is the change in concentration. So there's not much here, there's a lot here, some goes this way. Now D for air is 0.153 and D for water is 0.00002. So it's a lot slower in water. So the moral of that is if I am using up oxygen, I better have an air pathway for the oxygen to come through. And what I always think about is all those old episodes of Flipper where some nutcase gets himself trapped in an air pocket in a cave underwater. And Flipper has to go and find the experienced divers to bring him a new tank or to buddy breathe him on his way out. So there is some oxygen trapped in that air pocket, so oxygen can get there, but it can't get there as fast as the idiot breathes. So that's my first throwback. My second throwback is this. What do you respire when there's no oxygen? This is a hint from a Mad Max movie. You recall, and Mad Max started out in like the 1979 movie having this fast car that had a turbo pump that pumped air into the engine. And he could go really fast. And whenever he caught up to anybody, they just basically fell apart. These were crazy, spiky guys with weapons all over the place. But if the car caught up with them, they would fall apart and just give up. Well, so Mad Max was doing pretty well until somebody came at him with this car that pumped nitrous oxide into the engine. And then it could go really fast too. And of course, then Mad Max starts to fall apart and doesn't use his weapons, doesn't do anything evasive, he just falls apart and it's rough. If anybody wants to explain that to me, that's fine. But at any rate, that's a hint for what organisms will do if they run out of oxygen. So in this table, we've got how cars combust and how organisms in water burn fuel. In cars, normally they use oxygen. They mix C8H18, and that's octane, with oxygen. And for every bit of octane, they get out this much energy. And it's negative because when the reaction is done on this side rather than that side, when the reaction is done, there's this much less energy in there, and it came out as heat. Now, so the humongous truck, which was the one that used the nitrous oxide, didn't use oxygen. It did use octane, just like the car in the oxygen, but instead it used nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide still does the job because it breaks into nitrogen and oxygen and then combines the oxygen with the octane, to make CO2 and water, just like it did over here. And notice that when they do this, they get out even more energy. So this nitrogen stuff might be pretty good for oxidizing biological fuels as well in water. Let's take a look. So if I'm some kind of organism and I've got a lot of oxygen, I can take a molecule of sugar and combust it or oxidize it with oxygen and get out carbon dioxide and water. And I get out a pretty good yield of energy, not as much as we got from octane, but pretty good. Well, we can also do it with a nitrogen compound. We can take the sugar and use this chemical here, which is called nitrate. It's got an N and 3 oxygens and then a minus charge. Then we add a little bit of acid. H plus is acid in water. And we get out carbon dioxide and water and nitrogen, which we put in right here. And look at this. The yield from this reaction is 2.88, and the yield from this is 2.71. It's not really much worse. It's a pretty good deal using that nitrate to oxidize. And it turns out that there are even a lot more reactions that you can use. Again, we started with oxygen, and that works out nicely. We tried nitrate when we ran out of oxygen, and we still got a good bit of energy yield from that. And then if we run out of nitrate, we can use iron. We can actually use this rust material here, ferric hydroxide. And we take an electron from here and we put it on the iron. This is iron plus 3, and this is iron plus 2. So we've used the iron as an oxidant. It's kind of hard to think of. We think of solids as a fuel, possibly. We don't think of it as a replacement for oxygen. But in this case, that iron is a replacement for oxygen. So we oxidize this iron and we get this iron 2. And we get a lot less energy, but we get some. And then if that doesn't work, we can use sulfate. We take that sugar, we take some of this molecule here, SO4, and then some acid. So in other words, these together are H2SO4, sulfuric acid. And the oxidation goes through. We oxidize this using the sulfur, and we wind up with carbon dioxide and water and hydrogen sulfide. So even though the diffusion is slowing us down, so we're not getting oxygen to the place where our cells need it, there are other things we can use instead of oxygen. Okay, focusing again, you get energy out of all these reactions, although some of them give you a lot more than others. And then in a lot of these reactions, we're putting in H pluses, we're putting in acid that doesn't show up over on this right-hand side of the equation. So we're consuming acid. Okay, here is my warm, fuzzy picture of organisms who are carrying out this stuff in the wetlands. Jack and Tommy both had lots of pictures of warm, fuzzy organisms. These are mine. This is Rothia grown in the lab, looking like little dots. And this is an actinomycete. I don't know the exact genus or species, and it's looking gnarly, possibly an environmental sample of some kind. Okay, so now I've got a lot of consequences of that, of those different respiration pathways. First of all, nitrate reduction can remove a pollutant from water as it passes through a wetland. Nitrate is a pollutant. The drinking water standard for nitrate is 10 milligrams per liter. So if a stream has more than 10 milligrams per liter nitrogen as nitrate in it, it's not suitable as a drinking water source, even if you do let all the stuff settle out of it and disinfect it. The problem with nitrate is that higher concentrations interfere with hemoglobin, especially in babies. And there's something known as blue baby syndrome, where nitrate reacts with hemoglobin and prevents the baby from using hemoglobin to get oxygen all over its body. So notice again, oxygen and nitrate are acting sort of the same way. They both grab onto hemoglobin one way or another. All right, and nitrate is a common non-point source pollutant in areas with lots of agriculture. I used to live in Illinois and was surrounded by cornfields, and they would put on as much nitrogen as they can, because for every pound of nitrogen they put on the field, they get more corn. maybe not a pound's worth, but they'd still get more corn. So they need to find a way to get the nitrate out of the water running off the cornfields before it gets into the stream. And this is one of the things they've tried. This is basically a big pit filled with wood chips. And they lead the stream water somehow from the farm field into this pit and let it stay there and then let it come out into the stream. And the idea is that the wood chips will deplete all the oxygen, and then the organisms that are living on the wood chips trying to degrade the wood will say, oh, we're out of oxygen. What do we do? Oh, we'll use this nitrate. And then they'll get rid of that nitrate and send it on into the stream. Okay, a second consequence of these funny respiration pathways is, as I said, bacteria can also use the iron as an oxidant. And sometimes we use the word electron acceptors for oxidants. So iron 3+ accepts an electron to become iron 2+. The iron 3 is called ferric, and the iron 2 is called ferrous. So ferric iron becomes ferrous iron. Ferrous iron is not so colorful, and it's more soluble. So in wetlands where there's no oxygen and bacteria start to use things other than oxygen as an electron acceptor or as an oxidant, you get these gray models where iron has been discolored and dissolved away. And that's a major feature of wetland soil. And you also may see some red staining if that water seeps into the soil and comes out in a stream somewhere down the hill. And that's where this ferrous iron is getting oxygen again and becoming ferric iron. And this is a picture of some hydric or wetland soils. And you can see that as you go deeper and deeper, it's grayer. All this red is faded away, and what's left is a gray soil. Excuse me. And then again, this iron in the red part has been used as an oxidant for organic matter. And it may stick to the rocks or it may be dissolved away, but whichever, what it leaves is gray. And that's called glaying. So glay is gray, but not all gray is glay. Okay, a third consequence of this is that acidity is consumed. And I pointed this out earlier. Nitrate, iron, and sulfate reduction all have H+ on the reactant side, but not on the product side. So as you go through these reactions, they consume acidity. Okay, it's time for a pop quiz. Use the chat box to write down 2 ways that wetlands remove pollutants from water before they get into the streams. Do, 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 do. I can't find the chat box.
Go to the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, no, I found it.
Okay.
Okay. So the answers I had in mind are 1, removing nitrate from water, for instance, off the farm before it got into the stream. And then the other one that I had in mind was reducing any acidity in the water by using those reduction reactions. There are a couple more I want to mention that I'm not really going to do anything other than mention. One is trapping sediment. If you take the water and let it run into a pool, it slows down, and any suspended sand and silt there will start to fall down to the bottom of the pond as the water is slowed down. And that's something that happens in wetlands. Usually the water widens out a bit and slows down, and sediment will fall to the bottom of the wetland. But wetlands with a lot of plants are even better at capturing sediment because they've got so much plant surface area. And the particles can actually stick to the plants and therefore get out of the water. And in fact, the plants can also make sort of slimy chemicals that act as polymers inside the water, even some distance from the plant, and tie smaller particles together so they're bigger and again fall to the bottom. Another thing going on in wetlands that can capture pollutants is plant growth. So for instance, if I have a chicken farm and a big pile of chicken litter, if the water coming off of that gets into a wetland that's full of really, really fast growing healthy cattails, those cattails may take in that phosphorus and use it to build their own biomass instead of letting it go out in the stream. Okay, so all right, there's one more really bizarre consequence that I like. That's a biogeochemist thing. Wetlands can actually export energy with these respiration pathways. So I mentioned sulfate reduction. You use the sugar and you oxidize using sulfate and of course acid, and you make CO2 and H2O and hydrogen sulfide. Now this is soluble and it can seep down through the soil, and when that water comes out into another stream, an interesting thing happens. What I really want you to think about is the salt marsh here. Of course, in a salt marsh, the tide goes up, the water's on top of the salt marsh, and then the tide goes down, the water trickles through the salt marsh, and then comes out in a channel somewhere, 50 feet over. Now, when that water comes out into the channel, that channel has oxygen in the water. And it has oxygen because it's moving and it's open to the air. So it's got oxygen in the water. And then there's a bacteria that can burn that hydrogen sulfide with oxygen. So this is a funny fuel. It's hydrogen sulfide instead of sugar. But it burns that hydrogen sulfide with oxygen. And it uses that energy to catch carbon dioxide. So it's acting sort of like us because it's burning something to get the fuel, but it's acting sort of like a plant because it's using the energy to catch CO2 rather than getting it from the food. But at any rate, this material then becomes the basis of a whole nother food chain. Usually we think of a food web or food chain as you put in light, you make plants, animals eat the plants, bigger animals eat the smaller animals, and there's your food web. But in this case, we've got these bacteria making biomass, and little animals eat the biomass, and bigger animals eat the little animals, and then fish or really big animals can eat those middle-sized animals. But whereas with plants, it's all based on the plants, in this case, it's based on the sulfide that the bacteria are using to get energy. So it seems like it's kind of isolated from photosynthesis, but it really isn't, because for one thing, photosynthesis made all that organic matter that depleted the oxygen. And on the other hand, photosynthesis made the oxygen itself. So it's really not isolated from photosynthesis at all. Okay, I want to pause for questions here before going on, if anybody has any. All right, well, so much for that. Oh, another warm, fuzzy picture. This is Biogeochemistry, a bacterium that takes hydrogen sulfide and oxidizes it using oxygen and forms another whole food chain. And actually, these white sulfur bacteria are things that we see sometimes in acid mine drainage spots. Not everywhere, but a few of them. Okay, so that all started asking you to breathe. Now that you're relaxed, I'm going to talk about stress. We talked about how plants use light to take in carbon dioxide and make biomass or sugars and let out oxygen. But that's not what all parts of the plant do. If you are a root, you're not a leaf, you don't have sunlight on you, how do you live? Well, actually, you live just like an animal does. Roots are heterotrophic. Roots have to use sugars or whatever the plant sends down and oxidize them with oxygen or whatever is available in order to function for the roots and support the plants. And these are 3 cattails. And they were all grown in 5-gallon buckets in a growth chamber in the lab, which is this little closet with a bright light. And this one, they were all grown in about a foot of soil. This one, there was a hole in the 5-gallon bucket about 3 inches above the bottom. So the water could drain down to 3 inches above the bottom. So there was about 9 inches of soil that was not saturated with water. In this one, the hole was at the top of the soil. So all the soil that they grew in was basically water. It was saturated. And in this one, it was the same as this one as far as where the hole in the bucket was, but we also added a gram of sugar for every liter of water. So that meant that anything living in the soil would use that sugar to deplete the oxygen, and that this plant was growing in its roots were in a low oxygen environment. And you can see that it was stressful. These 2 grew pretty well, but this one didn't grow so well at all. So low oxygen in the rooting zone is stressful. There are a lot of adaptations for plants in that situation. And the basic summary of how they work is that they will do whatever they can to get more oxygen down to the roots. In this case, this tree has made folds in the trunk near the rooting zone. And it does that so that there's more surface area for oxygen to get into. So more oxygen gets through the bark here, and then more oxygen can get down to the roots. Then there are knees or pneumatophores. These are things that bald cypress or water tupelo might have. And at some distance from the tree will stick up these pointy things. And again, oxygen can diffuse into the pneumatophore, and then it's closer to the rooting zone, and it's easier for the roots to get that oxygen. You can also increase your surface area by having multiple trunks. One trick that plants will use is to keep the roots as shallow as possible. If you go deeper, it's going to be wet longer, and the oxygen is going to be present even less. Another trick, instead to increase oxygen getting into your trunk, you can actually have little holes. And in this case, those holes were there, but then they got covered up when the plant didn't need them anymore. You can also have tissue with a lot of air pockets in it. And the oxygen, as we said at the very start, oxygen will diffuse through air a lot faster than it'll diffuse through water. So that's a good trick. And that's called Erenkoma tissue. You can have inflated stems, and that's good for keeping part of your plant high up near the surface of the water if you have to. And it's also good for having an air pathway to get to your roots. Similar story with floating leaves. If they're at the top, they have more access to oxygen. The more oxygen you get in your leaf, the better it can get down to the roots. Then sometimes you can have different specialized leaves, some of which are good for, are really thin, and it's easy for the air, for the oxygen to get through and into the whole body of the leaf, but a different thicker kind up in air where, because it's full of air rather than water, it still gets into the leaf. Then there's adventitious roots, roots that start from the plant before it's in the water and go down into the water from the air. And then there's some plants that have so much air in their roots that they actually change the environment, and you can see little red streaks. And we know how that happens. The oxygen coming out of the root actually oxidizes some of the iron, and therefore gets these little red streaks. And I'm going to talk about oxygen coming out of the roots. It's thought that that's important to control hydrogen sulfide, which, as we saw, happens when it's very anaerobic and you start reducing sulfate. That hydrogen sulfide is actually toxic to roots. So if you can pump oxygen through your roots and then out into the soil, you might be able to oxidize that hydrogen sulfide and keep it from poisoning you. Okay, there's another picture of the oak, of the cypress knees that I kind of like. Okay, so this is a slide about a plant that has an even trickier trick for passing that oxygen around. And it has a trick where if you heat the leaf up, it pressurizes an air pocket within it and pushes that air down through Erenkoma, through air passageways, and then it lets it pump out through a colder leaf, a leaf that either isn't angled at the sun the same way or is older and deader and doesn't heat up as much when the sun is out. So it's sort of an active way of, it sort of does HVAC. It pumps the air down, makes sure there's oxygen for the roots, and then lets it out again. And then somebody figured out that Phragmites has a really cool trick as well. It has some broken twigs and branches or stalks that are actually holes facing up. And when the air blows over them, it does a Venturi effect. So you remember in high school lab, you turned on the water faucet and attached a hose and it made a vacuum. That's the same sort of thing. The wind goes over the holes, creates a vacuum, and the air circulates down into the root and out. I think they say that the wind will be higher up here than it is here, so the pressure will be lower here, so it'll go in here and out there. I did some work at WVU on trying to document the air coming out of plant roots, the oxygen coming out of plant roots. And one idea about this was that if you're trying to treat sewage, you need to get oxygen into the water. Well, maybe you can do it by having very active plants pumping their oxygen into the water. So we were testing different plants to see if we could document this. And this is a vessel that we used. This is all made out of plexiglass. This part and this part are connected. We would put a plant in this part and sort of let it grow hydroponically a little bit. And then we take one or two juicy roots and lay them out in this part. Then we would pour agar over this part and let it harden. And all the time we had nitrogen blowing over it so that we wouldn't get any oxygen in that agar, dissolved oxygen into the agar. And then we would poke at it with a little oxygen sensor that was made out of a little tiny capillary of glass. It was very delicate, and they were easy to break, and I broke at least one, probably two. So we would poke down at that root using this thing, which is a micro manipulator, made me feel very scientific. And we would measure the oxygen concentration as we got closer and closer and closer to the root. And this is the sort of thing we found. Oops. So the root is here, and we're coming from here and going this way. And as we come closer and closer to the root, we start seeing more and more oxygen. So when we got to, that doesn't seem right. When we got to within a millimeter of the root, I think we got closer. I'm not sure that these units are correct. We would see oxygen concentration of, something like 0.07 moles of oxygen per cubic meter. And I'd have to think a little bit to make sure to tell you how that compares with usual oxygen dissolved in water or oxygen in air. But it's not that much. But what we found by doing this was that this root was kicking out about 0.27 nanograms of oxygen per square centimeter of root. And this was Acorus calamus. And it was our champion for kicking oxygen out of the roots. And Acorus calamus, we have some in our yard. It seems to grow in heavy, wet clay soils. And that kind of makes sense. If you're going to pump oxygen out into the soil, you don't want to pump it out into a real loose soil where water flows through it really easily, because then the water would mix and take all your oxygen away. You want it, if you're pumping out oxygen, you want it to stay right close to where your root is to help out your root and not just add stuff to the water downstream somewhere. And we tried another trick where we put the roots into agar containing methylene blue. Sorry about that. Oop. And methylene blue, it turns blue when it catches oxygen. So all of this area, there was no oxygen in the water. You can see the surface is starting to catch a little bit of oxygen. But some of the roots also show up blue. And again, this is Acorus calamus. And you can see that on some of these long roots, you're getting spots of blue and stripes of white. Sort of goes blue, white, blue, white. So it's not everywhere on that root that you're catching, that oxygen is leaking out. It's just you have to get lucky when you're poking at it to find a place that has oxygen. And also you see that on this older root that's got some dark stuff going, you don't see too much blue. But you do see that on some of these tiny, tiny roots, some of those are pretty blue. So we didn't finish the story there, but we definitely convinced ourselves that Acorus calamus kicks some oxygen out of its roots. All right, so I'm going to summarize. Slow diffusion of oxygen in water means that other respiration pathways are common in wetlands, and those other respiration pathways include respiring using nitrate, iron, and sulfate. And there are consequences. Nitrate can be removed from water, and that's a pollutant, so it's a good thing. Acidity can be removed from water, and that's a good thing. Iron can be removed from the soil, and red soils make gray soils, and that's a definite way that you identify a wetland. And then there's some strange things, like energy is actually exported from the wetland into some other ecosystem where the water finally mixes with oxygen. There's the whole wetlands as kidneys things. Wetlands affect water quality by removing nitrate, by removing acidity. They can trap sediment, and a rapidly growing wetland can trap all those nutrients as well. And then it does funny thing to plants. Low oxygen can mean stress for plant roots. Plants have a lot of tricks for getting some oxygen down to their roots, and sometimes it even gets out of the roots and affects the environment where the roots are, what we call the rhizosphere. And as I said, I ran a little short, but I'll take questions. And yeah.
Martin, did you cover how nitrates get into the waterways and why it's important that wetlands filter and remove those?
Well, the classic one is fertilizer. So for instance, from a cornfield, farmers generally discover that the more nitrogen they put onto the cornfield as fertilizer, the more corn they'll grow. And you know, they observe things and they do these calculations and say, well, you know, when I put on 10 pounds of nitrogen, I got 10 more pounds of corn. And when I put on 20, I only got 18 more pounds of corn. So they're aware that there's a diminishing returns kind of thing, but still they get so much more for nitrogen that it's not like they can afford to stop putting it on. But the corn doesn't use all of it. So some of it winds up in the water that is coming out of the cornfield. And therefore, and that comes out, that form of nitrogen is nitrate. It turns to nitrate in the soil. And that's why it would be good to run it through some kind of wetland, some kind of anoxic zone, so that it will be turned from nitrate into some other kind of nitrogen that doesn't stay in the water. And generally it turns into either nitrogen gas or nitrous oxide. Nitrogen gas is better because nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas.
Martin, does the aquatic life get negatively impacted from having the nitrate in there? Like, what does it do to aquatic life? And why is it important to get it out of the streams?
Well, the answer I'm most familiar with is for drinking water. We can't make drinking water out of stream water if it's got more than 10 milligrams nitrate N per liter in it. It probably affects some of the other organisms as well, but I'm not familiar with that.
Also creates algae blooms, right?
Well, yeah, but you have to have lots of nutrients for that. And you can get algae blooms without nitrogen if there's a lot of phosphorus in the water. And that's why I mentioned the rapidly growing down from the chicken yard where the chicken litter is leaching phosphorus out. But yeah, nitrogen will accelerate it as well.
Martin, I thought that your point about low oxygen in the rooting zone is stressful to the plant had some nice crossovers to generally vegetable gardening or any type of gardening. And you were talking about various adaptations that plants might make to get more oxygen to their roots. And I was thinking in gardening about earthworms and soil compaction and that kind of thing. In gardening with annuals, are there some mechanisms that those vegetable crops, so to speak, will take to increase oxygen levels to the roots?
I really don't know. They probably do have tricks. Corn is known for its adventitious roots, but I think those are generally thought to be more for support than for oxygen.
Yeah, the adventitious roots, that was very interesting as an adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I actually had one other question about the sedimentation. You said the sedimentation is trapped in can be trapped in wetlands, and I was just wondering how over a time span, how long does that sedimentation stick around before it moves to some other location?
Well, wetlands can fill up. And I don't know, and it depends on how much sediment is coming into them. And it depends on the hydrology as well. Sometimes when a wetland fills up, it actually builds up, somehow the edge of it, a little bit more sediment may pile up on the very edge and let the water level go even higher. But for the most part, they can fill up and the water will find a fast way through the wetland and get out the outlet and bring its sediment somewhere else. And how fast that happens, it could be thousands of years, or it can probably be very quickly. It can go very quickly if a lot of sediment comes in. And very quickly, I want to look at one of the questions in the chat box that went by a little faster than I could see it. One thing that DEP does to protect wetlands is to have a construction stormwater permit. And what that is, if you are building something and you're disturbing more than an acre of land, DEP requires you to say exactly how you're going to do it and all the practices that you're going to use in order to keep sediment out of the waterway. So if you follow the construction stormwater permit, you ought to be able to keep the sediment out of the waterway and slow down how fast any wetland downstream might fill in.
Martin, you have a couple other questions in the chat box there too.
All right. If you see huge cornfields, do you know if there are wood chip zones there to filter the nitrogen? You can probably bet that there are not. That's a fairly unusual thing. I don't think that a lot of farmers are doing that, and I don't think a lot of them are doing that in West Virginia. Pollution on the Chesapeake Bay, can wetlands help it out? They certainly can. And so I'm imagining, again, I'm imagining this wetland that's full of really, really dark green, tall cattails that's just downstream from a chicken yard in Hardy County. And those cattails are taking up as much phosphorus as they possibly can, so that it doesn't get into the Chesapeake Bay. Of course, the Chesapeake Bay has a problem with algae and it has a problem with sediment. And to deal with the algae, everything that keeps phosphorus out is a good thing. Everything that keeps nitrogen out is a good thing. And to deal with the sediment, everything that keeps sediment out is a good thing. So that's the kind of wetland that can help with the phosphorus. You probably don't want to build two different wetlands. So if you can rig that wetland with the cattails to make sure that the soil is anaerobic, and it shouldn't be too hard to do that, you ought to be able to get the nitrate out as well. And then any wetland you build, you'd probably build a wetland, maybe not downstream from, well, you want to be very careful that your farm doesn't lose sediment into the water. But if it is, then a wetland can certainly help with that as well. And of course, the same is true with golf courses. They put a lot of fertilizer on there to make it nice and green. Anything they do to catch the nitrogen and the phosphorus will be good for the water downstream, especially in a lake or in the Chesapeake Bay. Yeah, wetlands can help the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, what is DEP doing to improve the quality of West Virginia wetlands? Well, there is no program that I'm aware of where we're going out and taking and improving them by either rebuilding them or by taking out the invasives and raising the floristic quality of them. That's something that there are people in the DEP who are working on, but I wouldn't say it's a major program yet. Jack mentioned some of the laws that we use to protect them, especially the Water Pollution Control Act for West Virginia, and then the Clean Water Act, which empowers the Army Corps to protect the wetlands by requiring different permits before you go in them. Jack and his group are working very hard at finding the really, really, really cool wetlands. So from what Jack was saying yesterday, you can find a wetland like the one he showed the picture of in Charleston, where it's a wetland and it's got a water table and an anaerobic soil and wetland plants, and it's doing a lot of those kidney functions, but it's sort of not really very special because it just has cattails or it just has reed canary grass and nothing else. Or you can find wetlands that have these really, really rare plants and these rather rare animals that are really special for that reason. And that's not so much for the kidneys of the landscape kind of thing as it is for the habitat kind of thing. But one thing DEP is doing is finding those really cool, important habitat wetlands and giving them special attention so that it will be even harder to disturb them. Okay. As soil builds up, vegetation can build along with it too. Yeah. Okay, that's from Tommy. Sorry, Tommy. Oh, there you go, Tommy. All right, any other questions?
Martin, can you put your contact information in the chat box?
Yes.
Could you tell us where the wetlands are in Charleston that were referred to?
Tommy, can I get a lifeline?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. We have, I guess it depends on what type of wetlands you're looking for, like how high of quality you're looking for. There's in South Charleston, a wetland that I use for educational purposes, which is, it's not a very good one, but it's a good place to get your feet wet and learning about them, is the Ward Hollow wetland. And it's up in the business park there in South Charleston, just off McCorkle, or sorry, off of Kanawha. There's also wetlands in Kanawha State Forest, in Hurricane, and Cross Lanes. And we actually have a map that maybe we can send that as a link out to everybody, that you can, type in, I think your area code, or not your area code, your zip code, and it will zoom in and kind of show you what's in your area there. So
Yes.
Probably not
Thank
the
you.
exact answer, sorry.
No, thank you. It's good.
Okay. One more thing I want to say about what the DEP is doing to protect wetlands is some outreach, such as these OLLI classes, which were Tommy's idea to get us into. So cheers to Tommy for that.
And just to add one thing here to make sure everybody, if you're not seeing in the chat box, make sure that you heard this. Martin and I, we work with watershed groups, and those are like our connections to these different little pockets across West Virginia. And if you want to support wetlands, if you want to support, you know, clean water, it's really important that you connect to your local watershed organization, or that you even form your own, and we will help support you. Without people on the ground in these communities, it's really hard for us to get projects going without local stakeholders. So I dropped a link to our watershed improvement branch page if you want to check that out, but you can always reach out to Martin, Jack, or I, and we can connect you to people in your area that, you know, want to see improvements if that's something you're interested in.